Joshu asks about death. Joshu asked Toshi, when a man who dies the great death revives, what then? Toshi replied, going by night isn't permitted. You'd best arrive during the day. Good morning. As Sensei Ryoda would always say, good morning, Bodhisattvas. Thank you all for being here, for the gift of your presence. And special thanks to those of you who are new to us. Welcome. We really appreciate your presence here. And I hope that you'll return again and again and again, as many of us have over the years. Roshi, in beginning a lot of her talks about sense of place. And I really resonate with that as an old geography student, getting this sense of place. And we don't elaborate too much about it. We usually mention the Native Americans, and I'll do that. But I wanted to share a few words from Dr. Thomas Woods, because this, as I said, is very, very important to me wherever I go, is to develop this sense of place. He said people develop a sense of place through experience and knowledge of a particular area. A sense of place emerges through the knowledge of the history, geography, and geology of an area, its flora and fauna, the legends of a place, and a growing sense of the land and its history after living there for a time. There was another an Urban Land Institute fellow, John McKeelan, and he said, a sense of place is kind of like the Supreme Court definition of pornography. I know it when I see it. And we've actually, he's gone on to say, we actually have lost that sense of place over the last 50 to 60 years. And as I said, it's really important. I also wanted to thank, I had 3 folks from our San Luis Obispo sitting group that have made it all the way down from San Luis Obispo today. Thank you. But that brings to mind the sense of place that we have there. A number of years ago, I was hiking at Montana de Oro. It's a state park about 5 minutes from my house. This was early in the morning, 6:30 in the morning, and I'm out there with one of my buddies, and we're cruising the trails, and we are laughing like kids. And make this bend, and right there is obviously a Native American man. The weathered face, the long ponytail, very powerful looking. And he smiles, and he says, it's nice to hear laughter on the Coon Creek Trail at this hour of the morning. I kept seeing him because I often go out there for sunset walks, and I'd see him, and he'd usually have this stern countenance about him. And we'd look at each other and kind of nod. And one time I saw him getting into his truck, and the truck had an emblem on it, or some writing. It said WWW Chumash something. And so I walked up to him, and I said, well, you probably don't recognize me or remember me. And he said, yes, I do. It was you and your friend a few weeks ago. We're on the Coon Creek Trail laughing. And I said, well, were you out gathering herbs, or what were you doing? And he said, no, we go elsewhere for that. But he said, this was where I was born. This is my home. And as it turns out, he's the leader of the Chumash group that's there locally. He made it clear he was not the one that was involved with the Sandy Inez gambling casino. So we have our Native American heritage right here. Roshi talks about the Tongva. And I understand, and I actually found this at the same time, I think that Earthmere had sent her a message that is it Kizh, K-I-Z-H. The name, the Tongva, was actually given by like an academic or something to them years and years ago. But this is and they're kind of having a resurgence now with this, Kizh. And of course up there, it's absolutely Chumash Indians that have been there for thousands of years. And sense of place, Montana de Oro, mountain of gold. During the spring, poppies everywhere and other flowers. And Los Osos, where I live, the Valley of the Bears. We used to have bears there, grizzly bears. And the only bear I've seen is my next door neighbor, who's kind of a grumpy bear. Well, over a month ago, I was talking to Roshi, and I can't remember if it was a Skype or we were on the phone. I'm not quite sure, but she mentioned a book to me, and she said, "Shōgen, you've got to read this book. I read it, and I thought of you." And I said, "Oh, okay." And she said, the byline is, "An ongoing lesson in the extent of my own stupidity." So what does it mean when your teacher wants you to read such a book? So I pondered this and probably read more into it than I should. And then 2 weeks ago, if those of you that were here, Roshi did a public face-to-face. And she said we were going to start talking about death. I said, okay, I've already had this talk, right? Ready to go. And she talks about, mentioned, and this is so it's a good summary, we talk about 3 types of death. One is, of course, the physical death, the skin bag, as Sensei Ryodo likes to, our skin bag. That I'm Shōgen Bloodgood. I was born October 9th, 1949, and at some point, hopefully in the distant future, I will die. This body will be gone. And then she said the second is the spiritual death, or great death. And of course, my heart stopped because that was my talk is Joshu. Talks about the great death. So I was taken aback. And then she talked about, and I think Maizumi had often talked about this, the dying to every moment, moment to moment, every activity. So I had a near-death experience when she started talking about all this. And I remember I was her Jisha, and I walked her out, and I said, I'm doing Joshu asks about death, and she said, well, you haven't been born to your talk yet. Thank you. But it got worse. Because not only was she kind of dabbling on the subject, but she also gave us an example from that book, a story from that book. And guess which story I'd already incorporated into my talk? Same one. But she didn't do the punchline, so I still have it. Joshu asks Toshi, when a man who dies the great death revives, what then? Toshi's reply, going by night isn't permitted, and you'd better arrive during the day. Well, your first reaction to this koan might have been like mine. It was kind of, what? And some of you here today I know are not familiar with our koan system. And so I'll just briefly, they're kind of what I call enigmatic stories that are teaching tools. We call them upaya in Sanskrit. That's a Sanskrit word. Or skillful means. And they help us toward the realization of enlightenment or our awakening. One of Roshi's Dharma brothers, Shishin, has an intro to a book of Equanimity, which is actually one of the collections of these koans. And he wrote, one literary wag facetiously said that koans are stories that Zen masters use to blow their students' minds. And that's been my experience. I've always felt they try to take your logical reasoning and run it into a brick wall. And there's a purpose there. They're not solved intellectually, as much as I have tried over almost 18 years now. You have to embody them. It's experientially. So I'll have to say that my noggin is sore, not from doing so many full bows, but from running my head into that brick wall so often for so many years. We have about 700 of these koans that we work with, and they're all in different collections, and most of these are old stories, going from India into the ancient Chinese masters, and oftentimes it's a student and a teacher in some kind of an exchange. This particular one is two Zen masters. Now, if truth be known, I am revisiting this koan. Oftentimes, as you work with koans throughout the years, you're going to come across them. Sometimes it's the same case that's in a different collection. But this one was the koan that I used for my Shuso Hosen. And that's your year as head trainee. And Myoho is the current Shuso. And her year is coming up fairly soon. Whoa. So she's been working with her Shuso koan. And then Enduring Vow will be coming in after her. So you work with this koan until I call it your coming out party, that you have the Shuso Hosen, which is a beautiful, beautiful service. And traditionally, this is your first Dharma talk to the Sangha. Traditionally, in our system, it's 8 minutes long. That's pretty short. Traditionally, I over-prepare for all of these. So I admittedly had enough material for a 2-day workshop. But I'll have to say, revisiting this koan was kind of like meeting an old friend. You know how that can be. You know, a lot of times you've been separated from somebody for a long time, and then you get together again, and it's like, no time has passed whatsoever. Well, I've met some of my friends and said, well, yeah, there have been some changes since our last meeting. But of course, I'm always feeling that they're the ones that changed, not me. But how true is that? So Ralph Waldo Emerson said, it's one of the blessings of old friends that you can afford to be stupid with them. I love that. So I really did have, the last few months I've had a lot of fun revisiting this old friend. So this particular koan, it's called a Mondo koan, which is saying question and answer. And the characters in this, Joshu, was born in the 8th century China. It's reported he lived to 120. That's some good genes. And we've seen him in a lot of our koans, or you do see him in a lot of our koans. In fact, I was intimate with him. A lot of our first koans are, does a dog have Buddha nature? Moo. And I'll have to admit I was intimate with Moo and Joshu for about 7 or 8 years. It took a while. So this particular encounter with Toshi occurred when he was in his 60s. And he was on a pilgrimage, which is following an age-old tradition where the monks after following their awakening, they traveled the country seeking other teachers to test the depth of their understanding. And he didn't slow down, so he was wandering all this time, and they didn't have freeways and all that sort of stuff. He was wandering all this time and didn't settle down to his own temple till he was 80. So I'm 67, and I think, well, we'll have a temple in how many years up in San Luis Obispo? I don't know. Now, Toshi, the other character in this, is less well known. But all the commentaries and all my research shows that he was no less an equal. In fact, it was Joshu that had heard of Toshi's reputation, and he sought him out. Toshi was kind of a reclusive, and there was even a verse of prophecy was written about him, and it said, "When has the Buddha principle ever been principle? Real emptiness is not empty. Dayton, Toshi, will dwell in an abode of silence, spreading the message of our teaching." So Joshu was known to be what they call the lips and tongue Zen. So he could joust with the best of them. My sense of him, he was very much like maybe an attorney. Quick-witted, pretty amazing. So he throws that question out, and he's baiting Toshi. So he's throwing one out to him and saying, what are you going to do with this? It's a test. And in Zen, there's another expression called kenjumon, which is the host-checking question. And the two of them had previous encounters. And so they knew about each other's strengths and weaknesses, if you will. But Joshu had said of Toshi, "I thought I was a robber, but you stole everything away from me." So a lot of the commentary and there's an introduction to the koan. They're talking about them as being very equal. Now, I'm a hospice chaplain, and I've worked with the end-of-life journey for, I've lost count, but I know it's over 1,000 patients. And of course, they're all dying, but each one is so unique. Their deaths are so different, and yet so much the same. It's the cessation of breath. They're passing away. And actually, this is what piqued my interest in this koan when I sat with Roshi to pick it out. And Joshu talks about death. Well, I'm a hospice chaplain, and very interested in all this. And one of our members at the San Luis Obispo sitting group had said, "Yeah, death and dying, it's what pays the bills." Sad to say that it's true. But of course, in my work, the patients don't revive. So what is this great death? Who or what dies? And what is it, or who is it, that revives? Yasutani Roshi threw, in my mind, it was kind of a wrench when he said, dying and reviving sound like a ghost. I'm not interested in that kind of thing. Okay. So, of course, we're talking about a spiritual death and rebirth. And this man who has died a great death means a person who has completely cut off any delusions and concepts. And what happens? A new life suddenly appears. And I really like what Yamada Koan Roshi had said. He said, only then will the activity of a religious person emerge. We call it a dropping away of body and mind, totally penetrating through all the barriers set up by the ancients and your own self-grasping ignorance. I remember my very first face-to-face with Roshi. She said, my name was Mark back then. She said, Mark, why are you here? I said, to kill my ego. And she said, no, you're not. We will always have our egos. This great death, of course, is something different. And there's something that changes. There's a shift that's made. They say once you have had this spiritual death that you're no longer going to be deceived. You won't keep grabbing onto all your projections and beliefs. It's seeing clearly life as it is. When you become Shuso, you get a fan. And on the fan it says, see as is. So we keep getting this repeated message from our teachers over and over and over again. Roshi, a while back, had a reading from the Song of the Grassroot Hermitage, which reads, meet the ancestral teachers. Be familiar with their instruction. Bind grasses to build a hut, and don't give up. And another quote, thousands of words, myriad interpretations are only to free you from obstructions. So there's a shift that happens. And what came up, most of the stuff from my talk, by the way, back in 2014, I think, I threw it away when I came and met this new friend. But this is one thing that did come up for me. Those of you that, many of you I see in this room are probably too young to remember Donovan, the singer Donovan. And he has this beautiful song. Well, I see some nods going on. Remember that? Anybody remember the song? First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. First there is a mountain, then there is no mountain, then there is. That was my sense of this. And of course, there's an old Buddhist saying that goes back a lot further than Donovan. King Yuan wrote, before I had studied Chan, which was Zen in China, that's the Chinese word for Zen, for 30 years I saw mountains as mountains and rivers as rivers. When I arrived at a more intimate knowledge, I came to the point where I saw that mountains are not mountains and rivers are not rivers. But now that I have got its very substance, I am at rest. For it's just that I see mountains once again as mountains and rivers once again as rivers. So what happens? Well, Roshi and a lot of us have had this, another Joshu koan. And it's a young monk coming into a monastery. And he says, I've entered the monastery, please teach me. And Joshu asks him, have you eaten your rice porridge? And the monk says, yes, I have. And Joshu says, then wash your bowls. And we're full of, I guess, this Zen speak. You've probably read as much of it as I have. But it makes sense. Before enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. After enlightenment, chop wood, carry water. And I really love the Zen, a lot of Zen writings deal with really the mundane, just the day in and day out stuff that all of us as humans do. After the ecstasy, the laundry. So no lofty states of consciousness, otherworldly states, washables, chopping wood. There's one of my favorites, dealing with a shit stick, doing dishes, just seeing what needs to be done and doing it. Sensei Daishin, who many of you know, when I talked to him, we had a wonderful talk, and he said, I think it's another quote from somebody else, but he said, you live a very ordinary life in a most extraordinary way. And he told me, your life will never be the same. It sounds kind of nice, huh? So, the second line in this case is, going by night isn't permitted. You'd better arrive during the day. That's Toshi speaking. In the dark, of course, things can be blurred. They're not clear. You might stumble. That was, I know, one interpretation that I read of this. In the light of day, of course, things are much clearer. Yamada said, he is saying that as long as there is a division into great death and great life, it's not the real thing. So there's a dualism. And as we good Zen students know, that we like to talk about essential nature. No divisions, no separation. He said it's like walking around in the dark. Come to me in broad daylight, he says. Yamada does, one of my favorite images he talks about is the fraction. Because I've struggled with this, at one time, I'm going into this euphoric state, I'm, dropping body and mind and no separation, and then there's the phenomenal world, our everyday life. Well, he talks about this fraction, with the numerator being the phenomena, our daily life, and the denominator, I think he puts down the sign for eternity, and that is our essential nature. But he makes this point over and over again, and I struggled with it for a long time. But he said a lot of times we find ourselves in the numerator and other times in the denominator, but life is the whole fraction. It's both. When I work with this koan, for me what came up is this, that kind of like the fraction, that the dark can also be seen as the absolute. When it's dark out, you don't see any differences of anything. It's black, moonless night. And the day is, things are seen, they're visible. It's the phenomenal world that we live in. And what came up, of course, is the relative and the absolute. Emptiness and form and emptiness. And you can't always live in that denominator as much as we might like to, this kind of blissful state. Buddha, it said, blissed out for some days and then came back and did teaching till he died at 80. Many of us are familiar with the ox herding pictures. And of course, they're pictures that show the spiritual path. And the very last one is the Buddha coming back into the marketplace, into the world. Well, each one of these koans also has an introduction. And in this introduction, it reads, Sancho and Seppo are spring orchid and autumn chrysanthemum. Joshu and Toshi, who are the characters in the koan, are Benka's jewel and N's gold. In the marked scales, both trays balance evenly. In the bottomless boat, they cross over the river together. How about when both people meet? Well, without going into like tons of detail here, the commentary basically is indicating that Joshu and Toshi are both equals. Neither is better nor inferior to the other. They're equal in their ability. But there's more there. When I was working with Roshi on this koan, what she brought up was the differences. They're talking about orchid and autumn chrysanthemums, both flowers, of course, but both so different. And during the time I was working with her, she had mentioned that Maizumi Roshi had orchids at his funeral. And a few years ago, Sasaki Roshi passed. He had chrysanthemums. But the garden isn't all flowers. There's weeds. What about the weeds? How do we relate to the myriad differences in our world? The flowers, the plants, and the weeds. It's kind of easy for me as I relate to loved ones, people that share my beliefs. Sangha members here, we have shared intention. But this is one body, and we're all connected. Even the people that are outside the sphere of my bubble. And what about the goings-on in our world today? I do prison work at a facility, a prison in my local area called the California Men's Colony, CMC. And we do counsel training with them. I've done actually counsel with years, but recently Jared Seid, who's actually a member here, Ocean, who is the director of the Center for Counsel, and we did a workshop, 2-day workshop with 25 inmates at CMC. And so we sit in this circle, and I thought they wouldn't really adapt to this very well, or it's kind of too, artsy for them, or hugging. But you would not believe the depth that these people went to in a very short amount of time. The story's absolutely amazing. Jared has a practice of keeping an empty chair in the circle. Some of us know about Elijah, setting a place for Elijah at the table. And then over time, seeing what arises. And he has had the experience of the inmates that have worked together saying at one point, we'd like to have a guard come into our circle. And of course, it's usually, these are factions. These are guys the guards that make their lives in their minds miserable. And then to come to the point where let's include them. I heard the stories, Evie and Roshi and some went to Rwanda, and I was just really taken aback. They had circles there where they would have victims and perpetrators in the same circle. One woman I remember that had been, her child had been killed, and the perpetrator was in the room. Was she ready to forgive at that time? I understand not. But he was still in that same room. So what about this last week? the here and now, Charlottesville. We have North Korea going on. It gives one pause. I was looking at the news yesterday, and there was a political scientist from Harvard who writes about democracy. And I'm going to butcher his name. Yascha Monk, M-O-U-N-K. And he said, partisanship in the United States today is dangerously deep. It's now at a stage where a lot of Americans have such a loyalty to their political tribe that they are willing to go along with deeply undemocratic behavior. And there was another young girl that they had interviewed, and she said, I feel like I'm in a bizarro universe where no one but me is thinking logically, she said. We have gone so far off the rails of what this conversation is about. Don't you feel that way about whoever the other side is from your position? It's of interest. She's a young black lady raised in Charlotte, North Carolina, and she supports Trump. Now, back to death. Roshi tells another story that I love, and this was there'd been a Sangha member that was here. He was a monk that had not been particularly active, but was very sick and in the hospital. Roshi, Igyoku, our Roshi, went to pay him a visit and borrowed Maizumi's car. And she brought the keys back when she was done, and she said, he asked, well, how he was doing. And she said, not very well. And she asked if he might not want to go and see him. And he said, no, not me. I want a live one. Do you hear me? And I really understand that. I do get that. But now, after years of being in hospice work, I have a little bit of a different take on it. There was a lady that ran the supportive care services, Lori Adolf, at CMC, where I'm a chaplain. And she's run the hospice program there. It's one of only 2 in the California prison system. And in her office, it had a slogan that was hanging, and she said, the dying are our best teachers. As I certainly believe they can be. So I bear witness to all of this. And what am I bearing witness to? Those that are dying and their family and friends. And I'll have to say, at times, I've seen some that were approaching death have truly transformative experiences. A lifetime of accumulation and striving, taking pride in their work, perhaps, their smarts, their intelligence, achievements, their physical prowess, and then they confront sickness, old age, and upcoming death. And some of them fight like hell. And some of them just start letting go. And the other point for me is that, of course, the dying are dying, but I work with the families of those that are with their friends and family that are about to pass away. So they, maybe these are the live ones, they are witnessing sickness, old age, and death. And they likewise can have a transformative experience. Isn't this the same thing that Siddhartha did as a young man? So the story that Roshi had shared from an ongoing lesson in the extent of my own stupidity. Now, the full title is Novice to Master. That's not what I heard when I listened first. But it was about Miss Okamoto. And it comes from the last chapter in the book that says, give yourself to death. And she had to fill in some of the details about it, but she actually quit her job as an educator to give herself to the practice. And then this was sometime in her 40s. And she became a disciple of Morinaga's teacher, Master Shōgen. And she attended to him until his death, I think it was at 87. Never became a nun. She was a layperson. And Morinaga, that's the author of the book, he said it was not her intention to become a great monk. So rather than focus on the training itself, she worked hard to make life smooth for the master whom she so respected. By washing clothes, cooking, and raising fresh vegetables, Miss Okamoto ensured that Shōgen Roshi would always be available to teach the Dharma to others. Anyone who looked at Miss Okamoto would see a thoroughly self-sacrificing person. When her teacher Shōgen had died, she moved to another temple, but kept contact with Morinaga, eventually coming to him and sharing that she had cancer. And she was afraid of dying. He wrote, she was a little old lady, short with a round, boyish face, but her exceptionally strict, upright lifestyle had given rise to something forbidding in Miss Okamoto. The young novice monks were never pleased when they were sent to her place on an errand. So she shares this with him. And interestingly, I just got a call 2 weekends ago. We were at a hospice fundraiser, and one of the RNs had called me on a patient, and she said, the patient's family said, Mom is afraid of dying. Can you come over? And so I did. But what really came up for me was that, not that there was fear, but was her reaction. He wrote, not only was Miss Okamoto afraid of dying, she was also ashamed of that fear. She felt it disgraceful to fear death after having been allowed to train so long under her teacher. She felt tremendous gratitude toward the Zen sect and toward the Roshi. And it was unbearable for her to think that those around her might feel Zen practice is useless, since it apparently does not even help one to overcome apprehension in the face of death. She said to him, what in the world is the problem with the way I have practiced until now, that death should be so frightening? Please tell me now how I have been wrong in my practice. He said she was opening up to him as if he were her son. And that resonated with me. I can remember I got divorced at about age 35, first marriage. I'd been studying Buddhism, not with a teacher, but I thought, I've really got it together. I'm a Buddhist student. I've got my act together. Well, I completely fell apart. I was completely devastated. And the worst part was this feeling, just like Miss Okamoto, having this feeling of guilt that I'm a Buddhist student. I shouldn't feel this way. I should have great equanimity in the face of crises. Well, I was very young in practice. So the practice that Morinaga gives her is what Roshi talked about, this dying to every moment. And it we did it in a very lively way when we had the face-to-face, and it can be a game. My wife Carla and I are playing this now. Honey, I'm being born to doing the dishes. I have finished. I am now dying to doing the dishes. And so you get the drill. And it's fun. But there's a current there that's pretty amazing. He said to her, be born in the garden and sweep with your broom. When you get into bed at night, die there. When you awaken at daylight, be born there. If you have cancer, be born with cancer. His last lines is in the chapter, always now, just now, come into being. Always now, just now. Give yourself to death. Practicing this is Zen practice. I don't know Roshi Bernie real well, but I spent a lot of time with him when we had our 50th celebration. He was here. And that's the sense I had with him. He had a stroke. And he's very well known for speaking about taking an inventory of the ingredients at hand and making the best meal you can. And that's exactly what he's doing. So Miss Okamoto had a shift with this practice. She ends up too sick to stay at home. She's at the hospital. And Morinaga talks about what the doctors and nurses are seeing, that she's just like incredible woman with everybody that she meets. And I've seen these shifts myself. I've been privy to them. It's amazing. I had one, the biggest shift I've ever seen was a lady, and she was not like a do-gooder like Miss Okamoto. She was a tough lady. It's New York, and I don't mean to stereotype, but she had that New York edge where, very young, breast cancer. And she was tough to be with. The whole hospice team got fired. We had one guy, the musician, she had requested him to go over and to tell stories, but no morals in the story. So Chris, the musician, would go through this fear and trembling every time he was going to go out. We'd look at stories and it was, how do we take the moral out of that story? And later, she was too sick to live at home and ends up in the hospital. And I get to visit her. Changed woman. She'd really come to terms with her life and with her death. Back to Miss Okamoto, and we'll be concluding here pretty quickly. Oregano had to leave the country, so he wasn't with her. And the monks, his students, were taking care of her. And she passes when he's gone. And his oldest student talked to him. And it was interesting. He said, although this was a man who seldom allowed any expression to cross his face, tears streamed down his eyes as he told this story. Before Miss Okamoto died, she said to him, looking back, I've led a pretty stuffy life all these years. So I think I'll just take a ball and go out and play in the woods now. Those were her last words. Morinaga said they placed a pretty ball made of colored threads inside her grave. My mom died a year ago May. My mom was not a stuffy person. She was lighthearted and playful. I wish you all could have met her. She was an incredible woman. a real bodhisattva. Toward the end, she would always be losing one of her earrings. So she'd be wearing one earring all the time. And then likewise, Mom always cut her own hair. And I have scores of memories of hers in front of the mirror in the bathroom, clipping away. And it became kind of a joke. And she said, when I go, I want some scissors to take with me. So at her request, we put her in her coffin with one earring and a pair of scissors by her side. And she had that same devotion Miss Okamoto had, directed, however, toward my dad, her husband, brother and I, and her friends. Oregano, going over his own experience of awakening, shared a verse from Shido Bunan Zenji. Die while alive, thoroughly die. Then just do as you will, and all is right. I see we have no time for questions, but any brief comments? We're supposed to end at noon, right? Isn't that it? Or thereabouts? I didn't even get to the appreciatory verse.
Ask a question. Thank you, Shōgen. That was really awesome. And I really like that story about the woman who was afraid of dying. And then I was just relating it back to the koan. And just, I guess my assumption is that she was afraid of the whole fraction of both being, of not wanting to arrive in the dark and better to go by daylight. Is that how you see it?
Yes. Yeah.
Could you say more about that?
No. Too many words already. Back to that Shuso Hosen ceremony that I talked about earlier. There's a line in there that the Shuso says, I hope there's enough water in the Pacific to rinse out my words from your ears. And I hope that's true. Okay, folks, the time is nigh. I went to my 50th. Go ahead.
Is it traveling by day the same as washing a bowl?
That's my take on it. Remember when I was talking about it, there's all these different interpretations, but yeah, mine is this: the darkness is the bottom of the fraction. No differences. And so the light is, we're going about our work. That's the noon. Is that Bernie Glassman's noon? Yeah. Moment of silence. Oh, as I said, this is the time. I went to my 50th high school reunion the week after our 50th celebration here. And I took this picture. There was a board with all these, bunch of pictures on it. And I said, but I had a class of like 350. And I said, I thought this was the attendees. And I said, Jesus, not many of us that are going to be here tonight to celebrate. And as I got closer, realized this was the memorial plaque. 59 from my high school, already gone. So, Crazy Horse, a Lakota, said, today is a good day to die, for all the things of my life are present.